You're listening to the What's Happening podcast with Gary Watts.
Good afternoon. I'm here with Mundi McCarty, and she's the director of the Hoover Library. Is that the right title, or
Vice President of Development at the
all
Hoover
right. Well,
Presidential Foundation? You're
it
close.
sounds like it's
Very
official.
It sounds wonderful.
So anyway, we're really excited to have her here, and let's start out. Tell us a little bit about your family. And I know that you're married to a famous golfer, right? Sean McCarty, who's been on the show before. But go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background. That's what I'd like to hear about.
Happy to. I am a West Branch native, as was Sean. Interestingly, we knew each other since preschool, Gary.
Really?
Yes, crazy story. Grew up in the same grade, sometimes the same classes, all through school, and didn't really start dating until high school. And from high school, I thought, you really can't be with someone through college. Surely that's a different experience. Obviously that worked out. Sean went to Iowa. I went to Iowa State, and we married after that. But yeah, both of us grew up in West Branch. I still have some family who live in town. And of course, I now work back in West Branch. So I love that family and kind of heritage history aspect of my roots in West Branch. So have a wonderful family. We have 4 children, 2 kind of grown and gone, 1 just married, and then 2 at home, 1 still in high school of those 2. So
you're playing golf, right? One's going to Iowa?
They are. My youngest son has made a verbal commitment to the University of Iowa for golf. Yes.
And they both play. How old are they?
Yeah, the boys are 19 and 17 and a half. So one just graduated. He's going to go on to be a welder. So in the next year, he'll be starting on that endeavor. And the one's still in high school at Solon.
Great. So West Branch Bears, Butch Peterson,
yes.
You heard the name,
Oh
right?
my gosh, of course. Who hasn't, right?
Working on that fundraiser, they're going to put you probably know this, they're going to do a statue of Butch coming down on the field in Little Rose Bowl.
Very neat.
So they just put the steps in, and they're going to have I think it's going to be bronze like Hayden Fry's.
Wow.
So that'll hopefully be done. I think they're starting to make it, but I think next spring, so not this football season, but the following football season, they'll have a statue of Butch coming down on the field. And I think he's got his arms crossed, and he's looking down the field like he always was, and has his visor on. So,
well, sometime you'll have to tell me the story of your connection to Butch, because I don't think I know that.
That's a long story.
Okay.
It take too long today.
Okay.
Yeah, we go way back too.
That's neat.
So anyway, we're going to talk today about President Hoover in the library in West Branch. I don't know how many listeners know this or not, but it's a fantastic library. It's right here in West Branch, down the road 10 miles. And Herbert Hoover was a fantastic person, lovely wife, Lou Ray, and from Iowa, which is just amazing. And I just want to talk a little bit about Hoover, and then I'll let you go here. I mean, a few things I read. And I think one of them, there's so many interesting things about Hoover. I went through the library maybe, 20 years ago. And I think they had a World War I trenches thing, which I've never seen those trench warfare. It was awful. But the exhibit was neat to if you like history, for what went on over there. But I didn't realize that little white house. I always would drive by it going into West Branch. I didn't know that was Hoover's house. And what is it? 2 rooms, and there were how many kids?
3 children.
3 kids and 5 people. Right. I mean, I don't even know where the bathroom was. It wasn't inside the house. Right?
No, you're spot on.
So anyway, that his father died when he was 6. His mother died when she was 9.
Yeah.
He was 9.
Yep.
I don't know how old she was. So he was an orphan.
Right.
Which, I watched a football show. I don't remember it was something about in Texas. They had an orphan team that was during World War II, and they were all orphans, and they ended up winning the state title. But it talked about how people treated orphans, and when I heard that, I'm just amazed. I think he ended up in Oregon, and he was raised by some family, but he had a tough upbringing. And anyway, I'll let you take it from there.
No,
I don't want to keep going here, but
no, you definitely know the story, and that's why his story is so impactful, right? Is his birth in West Branch in a 2-room cottage,
right.
One of 3 children and an orphan by the age of 9, 10. It's a very powerful, emotional part of his story for sure. But he always felt that that part of his story really was a part of who he was and really helped make him into who he was. So, right, this idyllic childhood, mother involved in the Quaker church because they were
Right.
Quakers,
That's right.
still have Quaker groups in West Branch as well. Dad, the blacksmith, and a young brother and sister, and a great little family lived right next to the creek where the birthplace cottage still sits. Loved fishing from a young age and right there in that creek.
They show him
And
trout fishing, don't
they
they? I mean,
do in the
yeah.
museum because that's something he carried with him throughout his
Yeah.
life, an interest for sure. And yes, landed in Oregon with an uncle, his mother's brother, who was a physician by training, by education here in the state of Iowa. He went to the State College of Iowa Medical School, and then traveled further west and had a young son pass away about the time that Hoover became an orphan, and said, why don't you send young Bertie, they called him Bert, out to Oregon? He can become a part of our family. And so that's where his Western swing, if you will, kind of began. So he was a sort of a makeshift member of a family, right? His family, relatives. And it's described sometimes as maybe a little bit of a harsh environment for him to live in with another family. But Hoover does reflect very positively on some of the lessons learned and some of the education he received there while in Oregon. His uncle was a phenomenal businessman. And so he picked up a lot of business acumen from working in his businesses. So that was a big plus.
Did he practice medicine?
His uncle, as a physician, did practice, but then he also became the headmaster of a Quaker school out in the area, and then had these other businesses that Hoover got to participate in.
I think one thing neat when I read about Hoover is he had Iowa roots, even though he was just a child, but he thought like an Iowan. He was a good person. He gave back. I think he donated his salary as president. We can get into that. He never took a dime.
Correct.
He was a multimillionaire by the age of 26 or 7?
Yeah, young.
Very young. And then, I can't imagine. I think he ended up being worth 2 or 3, 4 million. Well, today that's a Horatio Alger story. He's an orphan. And then he goes to Stanford, and he's in the initial graduating class, the first one at Stanford.
Right.
Which again is amazing how he got to Stanford. And, think of the acumen you have to go to Stanford.
Well, that's an interesting story, actually, because while Hoover got some education, both in Iowa and then out in Oregon under his uncle's tutelage, he really never had a formalized high school program. And so when he said, Leland Stanford's opening Stanford University is as a living memorial to his son who had passed away, and Leland Stanford, being the railroad magnate, opened this university and said, hey, the first class will be free. And so Hoover, not having a lot of financial resources, that was attractive to him. But he actually did fail part of his entrance exams. However, when he got a little bit of tutoring, he saw one of those tutors saw something in him and said, this young man has what it's going to take to be a student here. And he eventually passed those exams and became one of that first class at Stanford.
Did he go to high school?
I don't think it was a formalized program at all. It might have been some night classes here and some pieces there, but it was not a formal. He was working a lot for his uncle.
What year would he have been in Stanford? He was born in 1888 or
1874. Hoover was born, and I believe in 1891 he entered Stanford. I remember that because I graduated high school in 1991. In 1891, Hoover would have started college at Stanford.
So he went to Stanford. I think he majored in geology.
Right.
He met his future wife, Lou Ray, there, and I think she majored in geology.
She did, and she's an Iowan.
I didn't know
as
that.
well, from Waterloo, Iowa. Her family got to California because I believe it was her mother, was having some respiratory issues. And at the time, I think some of the advice from physicians was move to a drier climate. You'll have fewer issues than the humidity and perhaps the dust and things that occur in rural Iowa. So they landed by way of several other states and stops in Monterey, California, where Lou attended a lecture by the same gentleman who was a professor at Stanford and Herbert Hoover's advisor and faculty advisor at Stanford. So
small world.
Really.
She's from Waterloo.
Right.
And Monterey's beautiful, by the way.
Right.
Have you ever been there?
Many times.
Pebble Beach.
Yes. Gorgeous.
So majored in geology, and it sounded like he got in the mining business.
Right.
and was in China, Australia, all over the place, all over the world as a young man.
Exactly.
And I don't know how he learned how to make money, but he must have done it in mining, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. So when his first job was, he was sent to Australia. So in the outback of Australia, you can imagine in the early 1900s, right? He called it. It was Australia is a country of black flies, white heat, and red dust. He said there was not a lot there, and he turned over that mind in some of the procedures and policies that he implemented there. Plus, he found one of the richest veins of ore that has ever been discovered in the mines of Gwalia in Australia, in that mine. And actually, I think it's still a productive mine today.
what type of ore?
Yeah, I think they had a variety
Iron
of
ore.
ores. I would be lying if I
Yeah.
said all of the different types that they had worked with and discovered and what their focus was. But I do know he turned sick. They called him the doctor of sick mines. He would take an unproductive mine and turn it into something that was functioning and making money and, providing jobs and growing. So he was very well known for that.
So is it? I also read it was something that he made so much money. I don't know. By the time he was 40, he was worth a lot of money back then. I mean, millions. And then he decided to get in public service. Is that right?
That's right. And that's also a really pivotal time in his story, but really interesting. So he and Lou are in London with their two young sons at the time, kind of settling down, if you will, in London, which was the mining capital of the world. World War II breaks out. So the Hoovers are there in London, and about 120,000 Americans are there for the summer to vacation and holiday. And they get off the boats. The war's broken out. The banks are closing. They can't even get back on the ship to get their suitcase and their belongings. So the Hoovers are called into service at one of the Savoy Hotel in London. And the Hoover meets with the men. Lou meets with the women, and they find out what they need in the ways of clothing and money for a place to stay and meals. And the Hoovers help provide that mostly and a lot of with their own money.
With their own money.
120,000 people. They got back eventually on boats to the United States. And then eventually Lou and the boys went back when that was all finished. All of those loans, by the way, that they gave out repaid except for a few $100s. In the tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars they dispersed. So that for Hoover was a turning point. He realized, actually, there's a story about this. Some friends are visiting, and he comes down for breakfast one day, and he had thought about kind of his next step and said, let the fortune go to hell. This is what I need to do. I need to serve others. And from that point on, he was well known, obviously, by the American government for helping get those people home. He then was seen by Europeans' governments as someone who could potentially help, for example, the Belgian citizens who were isolated and starving to death with the war.
Was that World War I or II?
That was one.
And the
Yeah.
Belgians, he sent his own food and his own ships. And
He did. He did work with others to get that. But what Hoover was so instrumental and excellent at was negotiating with, warring groups, right? You had the Russians surrounding Belgium, and they did not want anybody putting foodstuffs in Belgium, and the fear was that they would take those foodstuffs from Hoover, the Russians or the Germans would, and not allow that in. Hoover had been around enough governments around the world, knew the power of monetary pressure, knew the policies that were in place, and had those relationships and was able to get that food into 7 million plus Belgian people.
See, people don't know that.
Yeah.
He's just kind of he's kind of, to me, the forgotten president. He takes the heat for the stock market crash. But
Sure.
just, he did that out of his kindness of his heart. He'd made his money, highly successful, and then he just started to give back. So shortly after that, he started to get in politics, right, and run for president.
Right.
And it was encouraged by FDR. I find that interesting.
Very much
Because
so.
FDR spoke extremely highly of him, which people would never know that. FDR had obviously four. That's when they changed the amount of time he could be president. I think they went to 2 terms. He had
Correct.
4 terms.
Right.
But, so anyway, he got into politics. Where did he start in politics? Was he a commerce secretary? Or?
Yes, under Harding, and then Harding passed away, and then Coolidge. So Democrat, right? There's
Right,
a Democrat
right.
there, and Hoover was working for them. But yeah, and along the way, I think Hoover and politics, obviously, at that point in time, didn't look like politics
nothing
today, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that comment you made about Roosevelt is spot on, because I think Roosevelt at the time didn't really know. Felt like Hoover might have been a Democrat, as the
Right.
terms were Democrat then.
Right.
But Hoover said, no, I'm a Republican, and he made that election himself. So Secretary of Commerce, Coolidge, or Harding Coolidge, and then all the great work that he did as Secretary of Commerce is another really amazing part of his story. Standardizing things from thread count on bolts and nuts to
Milk.
gallon,
gallon,
pint, or
yeah.
standardizing that from the 20-some container sizes there were
Yeah.
before.
Did he have something to do with planes, the commercial airlines?
Avionics, yes, aviation, because that was very much more of something that people shuttled stuffs to
Right.
and from rather than people. But Hoover could see that this was a tool that pretty soon should be and needed to be prepared to handle transport of people. So that from standardization to driving down the street and you see a red light here in Iowa City,
Green light.
but if you went out east, that red light might mean go, not stop. And so he helped to standardize highway safety as well.
He had tariffs too.
Yes.
He started tariffs at imports. I think he tariffed it, so
Yep.
raise money. I mean, I think that was a smart thing to do. All kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Amazing.
so then he got a little more into politics. And why don't you run for president?
Yep.
Do you know who encouraged him? I know FDR thought he'd be good, but
Right.
I'm just trying to figure out how do you get to that next step?
Yeah. And I don't know the exact, what was that decision or who was that came to him, but I think it was partially all of the great work he did as Secretary of Commerce.
Mm.
They often teased that Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce, but the undersecretary of everything else, because he was interested in making sure that government was more efficient and effective, and how could he make things better. So he did maybe dabble across the lines beyond what he did in Secretary of Commerce role. So I think they thought with that success, he also in 1927 was sent down to the Mississippi Delta area when they had the historic flood in 1927. So I think that putting that whole piece together, where he provided relief there in the States, plus the work he had done previously in Europe, people recognized that this was someone who could make things happen. And presidency was maybe the next natural step.
He seemed like a high energy guy that got things done, hard worker.
Very much so.
So he ran for president, and then shortly after he was elected president, they had the stock market.
He did.
We
Yeah.
went into a depression.
Hoover was warning Secretary of Commerce that the speculative stock market was not an ideal situation, but I think things were just going so well.
Yeah, the roaring 20s.
Bingo.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it is people don't realize it. At least I didn't until I studied it. I'm trying to figure how could the stock market go down to where there's nothing there. Well, I didn't know it, but it sounded like in the day, in that time frame, you could buy stock. You only had to have 10% down. So about $100 stock, you only had to have $10, and the rest you could borrow.
Yes.
So it was highly leveraged. So there wasn't a lot of cash. And well, today, if you buy $1,000 worth of stock, it's $1,000.
Yep.
There's no leverage in buying
Exactly.
stocks right now. You have to have the cash.
Yeah, and like you said, it was the 20s. Everything was just booming.
Right.
And Hoover, acknowledged that. He said, we've got washing machines now. In the home, that frees up traditionally women. So they're going to have more free time.
Right.
They're automobiles. So families are going to have more free time and probably want to leave their immediate area and explore. National parks is one thing. The efforts he made in dedicating and reserving land for national parks came out of that in the 20s with Hoover. Even though he wasn't Secretary of the Interior, he had a lot to do with a lot of those national parks that were.
You probably knew Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
In the national park thing.
Right.
Another interesting thing was I read that the first live TV broadcast, he was it. He was on TV.
Correct.
The first broadcast. Now, who'd have thought that? I mean, what are you talking about?
I agree. And he embraced technology like TV, radio. Lou as well was one of the, actually she was the first lady to have color video from the White House. And we have all of those films, and
That's
they're
neat.
fascinating to watch. But
Yeah.
both of the Hoovers were early adopters and accepted any kind of technology. They thought it was important that that's another aspect of, American life. These are things that'll make our lives better as Americans, allow us to do other things.
So he starts out as president and gets hit between the eyes with a ball bat with a depression, which was awful for everybody. You just the next day there wasn't any money and everything was worthless. The farmers, nobody had any money. It seemed like.
Yeah.
So here's something near and dear to West Branch that happens every year. It just happened. Hoover Ball. You play Hoover Ball?
We have a net and we have a Hoover Ball at my house.
You do?
So we play. Have the neighbors over. My sister and brother in law and kids play, and it is a blast.
6-pound ball, right?
Actually, ours is I think a 3-pounder, but you can get them in different weights, and the men play a different weight, I believe, than the kids do, and then the women as
It's
well.
heavy. I've tried it. I mean, it doesn't sound like, it's not like a beach ball. You just bang, so I've seen that play. It looks like a blast.
Yeah, it's
People
a
have fun.
volleyball height net, throwing that medicine ball, 3 people on a side,
Right.
and scored like tennis.
Right.
So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And Hoover, as going into his presidency, was a little overweight. So his physician, the White House physician, said, "Hey, I think you should be
Do
more
something.
active. And what sport do you like to play?" And he was like, "Not too big into sports." But he said, I was on a ship once. I saw the sailors playing Bull in the Ring, which was a medicine ball in the center of a ring of their sailors.
Huh.
And it was kind of like a keep away game with a medicine ball. And he said, that was interesting to me. So his physician created the game that is now Hoover Ball today.
That's
And we host the Hoover Ball National Championships there.
And West Branch.
Every year.
That's great.
Yeah. And kids have gotten involved. This year we had 100 teams for kids. And that has just exploded over the last 4 years.
So what else did he do as president? So obviously he takes the brunt of the depression, which was awful. But what else did he do when he's sitting president?
Yeah. So a lot of things. Al Capone was captured. They made the effort to kind of get rid of all of the racketeering and some of the things that were going on, in the mafia and whatnot, was a big thing. But I wanted to mention before we get off of the Great Depression piece, I think that was really hard for Hoover internally. We mentioned earlier, Hoover's a Quaker.
Yeah.
And Quakers are not very outwardly emotive necessarily. They believe that their role here on earth is to shine their light on others and to help where needed, and to put himself in a position that he would be displaying any kind of emotion in front of others was probably not his comfort zone. And so I think people misinterpret Hoover's handling of the Great Depression, or the view that they saw of Hoover, perhaps as not caring or not doing anything about the Great Depression. I think it was a really big internal, lot of strife for Hoover personally to see his fellow Americans struggle. But just among that, he cared a lot about the country, obviously, as a sitting president. And I think he and Lou did a lot behind the scenes during the Great Depression that weren't visible either. For example, we were talking earlier about the encampments of people without homes in DC and around the country. In DC in particular, a lot of those encampments happened to be the bonus marchers, who were veterans from the war, who were marching on Washington, D.C., saying, hey, we would like our benefits. But Congress hadn't yet approved their benefits, so they kind of decided to camp out and take up residence and cause a little bit of a ruckus. And they weren't hurting and harming anyone, but MacArthur was obviously the general at the time. And while Hoover asked him to, certainly we don't want any big riots, but you don't need to take excessive measures with the bonus march or bonus army that's down there. MacArthur didn't quite listen, and they did attack the army, the veterans that were there, which Hoover really never shared, that he told MacArthur not to take any action, but Hoover took the brunt of that. Again, kind of the way Hoover operated. But he and Lou, while those folks were down there in their encampment, Hoover and Lou provided all of the food without any fanfare. They didn't want anyone to know. They set up the tents for the food and many other amenities, if you will, for that group of folks, recognizing that they appreciated what they wanted and they deserved what they wanted, but Congress just hadn't approved their resources at the time. So it was a very sad.
World War I veterans.
Yes, very much. And the Hoovers did a lot of that behind the scenes, both during their presidency, before and after, that they wasn't really either talked about or discovered until after Lou's passing, especially, but then Herbert's.
Then there was another story about the Hoover Dam. And then when they dedicated it, they didn't even invite him.
Right.
They called it the Boulder Dam. And then I think when Truman was president, he renamed it the Hoover Dam.
He did.
It was during FDR's days, they left it as Boulder Dam. Just the politics of that. It's just amazing.
Yep.
It is now the Hoover Dam.
It is. And that was a great feat. I mean, the people working on that, what they accomplished. And I believe with Hoover kind of running that aspect, it was on time and on budget as well.
So another interesting thing, I'll probably skip around time frames, but
no, this is great.
another neat thing that people need to know is JFK sought his advice constantly. I guess he was always when he was in New York, he saw Hoover.
Yes.
And Hoover, I think, was it the Waldorf Astoria, or he was on the top floor or near it. And JFK would go there to talk to Hoover to see what you had issues being a president, and he'd get Hoover's advice, which I never knew. I had no idea.
Interesting story also behind that one. So Joe Kennedy, President Kennedy's father, met Hoover early on in his political career and really got to know Hoover, the man. And he felt so strongly about Herbert Hoover and had a lot of respect and admiration that Joe Kennedy made sure that each of his family members got to meet and get to know Herbert Hoover. So I think that's where the President Herbert Hoover connection happened. And that's really fascinating. Hoover visited the Kennedys, I believe, in the White House one year. And we have a lovely handwritten letter by Jackie Kennedy thanking President Hoover for his visit and how much they very much appreciated and respected him. So
the nice thing is that even though different political parties, they got along and sought each other's advice. And I don't know. I just think that's great. I wish we had more of that today.
Yeah, I think a lot of us do. Yes.
We all do, I think.
I think so too.
So he, then I think when he got out of the presidency, it was 33, right? 29 to 33 as president.
Right.
And then he went on and they kind of, I don't know what he did. He retired. But then I think Truman and Eisenhower brought him back to help him work in government, to maybe streamline it or work and be efficiency of government.
Right.
And both those presidents brought him back to do things.
They did. And we kind of title those period of years right after the presidency, really until Truman brought Hoover back into the fold, kind of as the wilderness years for Hoover. And he wrote a lot of books during that time frame. He did live in New York City in apartment 31A in the Waldorf Astoria. So still there, is my understanding, that apartment number anyway. And he and Lou lived together in the Waldorf until she passed in 42, and then 44, and then he lived there through his passing in 64. But so that's a really interesting piece about Hoover and Truman as well. Another Democrat and Hoover, the Republican. But my understanding is that when Roosevelt passed away, Truman was his vice president. And I believe it was within the first 100 days of Roosevelt's term, that final term of his, and that Truman was new to that role as vice president and hadn't really had a lot of conversation with Roosevelt. So I think he was learning fast and furiously, perhaps, when Roosevelt passed away, but recognized that during the First World War, Hoover had been one who was called into service to deal with European famine and relief, and had done obviously the work in 1927 in southern United States after the flood. And so Truman brought Hoover out of, would you say, the wilderness years, and knew, even with perhaps some of the administration holdovers from Roosevelt saying, don't do it. Roosevelt never wanted to bring Hoover back. Don't do it. But Truman did. And he knew he would find answers and the next steps through Hoover. And indeed, they had a then lifelong friendship.
It's interesting. Another thing is it took a World War II to get us out of the Depression.
Right.
All the you're ramping up on military equipment, and
right.
you hear stories of Henry Ford turned these plants into tanks and jeeps, and FDR went to him and said, "We got to have this," and they did it. And just the effort, the whole effort of the American people in 4 years, fought 2 theaters and won both of them is amazing. So now he worked for Truman, he worked for Eisenhower. Another interesting thing about his passing, it was in '64, right? And they buried him at the Hoover Library here, and then Truman was there, wasn't he, at the funeral?
Yeah, I believe he was. I know he was here in '62 when they dedicated the Presidential Library and Museum for the first time. Truman came back with him then as well. But yes, highly likely was at the funeral. We have some amazing photographs from that. The procession from the Cedar Rapids Airport. I've talked to people who were there at the airport when the plane landed, or watched the procession from a bridge overpass as it was coming down Interstate 80 into West Branch. It sounds like an absolutely amazing ceremony and dedication to quite an amazing man. And since you've been out at the Presidential Library and the grounds there, and you mentioned that he and Lou are buried there, one thing is really unique about the setting, where he's buried and where his home was. And when you go back sometime, take a look, because if you're standing at the birthplace cottage and you look to the southwest and see his gravesite and the flag, the American flag that's up there, it's an unobstructed view. And vice versa, if you're at the gravesite looking back. And Hoover said his desire was to always have an unobstructed view, so that any boy or girl, any person coming to his birthplace cottage or his burial site would know that they too can come from very humble beginnings, yet arrive in life as president, as a humanitarian, and give back to others. So he really understood what it was all about.
He's truly amazing. I think that's such a neat. And if you have, I got to make a pitch here. You've got to, if you've not been to West Branch, if you've not been to see the library, if you haven't seen the grounds where they're buried, Hoovers are buried, it's just a unique, really cool place. It's very solemn. It's beautiful. I didn't realize that where he was born, and then looking down that view. And then the library's great. So let's start talking about that. That's a lot on Hoover. So I think it's just too bad he's an outcast because of the Depression, and did so many things, and so proud that he was an Iowan, because he's the epitome of what Iowans are about, and he exemplifies what I think Iowans are. Let's go a little bit. Maybe we can go online, Caitlin. If you could put up some of the exhibits that are in that. Here we go. So Mundi, if you want to maybe talk about what's going on now at the library. So.
Yeah. So, and this is a neat thing about what you just said, Gary, is that we have people come to today's Presidential Library, even as it is, and it needs a renovation. It's been 30 years, since over 30 years. Ronald Reagan was here in 1992 at the museum to rededicate it. So what you're going to see are some images of what could be in the next reimagination of the Hoover Library. And to your note, most people don't know about Hoover, but when they walk out of the museum, even today, they say, "I did not know that about Herbert Hoover," and that is pretty incredible. So what you're going to see here in this example is an exhibit called A Perfect Hell. And this goes back to his time in Australia as a young mining engineer and all of those places that he worked, China, Burma, around the world. But it's going to be able to allow the visitor to immerse themselves in the exhibit. Today, we have a little bit of a barrier that separates us from actually standing behind Hoover at a desk as he's in Australia in the outback in the exhibit that we have. This exhibit, as you can see, people can walk up and in it, interact with some of the features.
Is it like a hologram? I know they have that at Lincoln.
That's right. They certainly do. So interestingly, it might be on some of the projections on the screens that you see there, but the same firm who did the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, it's concept design, they're doing ours because they're exceptional.
Have you seen Lincoln's?
I have not been.
Oh, you got to go there.
I need to.
It starts as a little boy chopping wood, and he's in the cabin reading. I mean, and those holograms are really interesting.
I heard that. So we're thrilled to be working with
That'll
them,
be neat.
and they us. So they're excited to work with
Yeah,
Hoover.
good.
So that's what some of these are. So one of the next ones will show Hoover during the presidency.
Yeah.
And what's neat about this exhibit is you'll see there, even the next two slides show this exhibit transforming while you, the guest, are standing before it.
Yeah.
So you're learning about what Hoover does as
Right.
president, but then you see what happens next, the Wall Street crash in 29, and then even one of the next ones. That's okay. They might not all be there. There it is. That's the Wall Street crash. And then it moves into the Great Depression. So we definitely address the Great Depression. And we think it's important to talk about because there's a lot of research coming out that talk about there are different theories about what happened today than what actually occurred. And they're learning more things about what happened in the Great Depression and the stock market crash and all of those pieces. So it's fascinating to hear the new revelations. So that's really an interesting one with the presidency. And that's the other version of the presidency. And then this is a really neat one, and it's going to be toward the end of the story when you walk through the presidential library. And it basically reflects on Hoover's future, looking forward with unbounded hope, which I think is something that Hoover very much saw for all of us. But his reflections on the work he did at the Hoover Institution, at Stanford University. They have now a think tank, a conservative think tank there on war, revolution, and peace. So all of his war papers that he collected when he was overseas in Europe, he brought those all to the Hoover Institution. And a lot of the presidency documents are in West Branch as well. But this schematic here shows the Hoover Dam and just the immense work and effort that took and the legacy that leaves for Hoover. Talks about uncommon individuals in this, uncommon people. Hoover saw that there was a lot of talk during the Roosevelt administration about the common man. And Hoover saw that differently. He said, the uncommon individual is the one that is going to take us to the next step, right? When you go to the physician's office or a surgeon, you don't want a common physician. You want an uncommon physician. When your car needs to be worked on, you want an uncommon mechanic, somebody who's going to do a phenomenal job. And that's what we all should be striving for and aspiring to. And so that is a great reflection here as well, that we all should look about how can we, be of service to others, but how can we all be uncommon and, lead, serve others, and do the right things. So those are going to be some of the core tenets in the Presidential Museum when it gets renovated. And it's an exciting project for sure.
Tell us a little bit you have a fundraiser going on, right?
Right.
And you're trying to raise 30 million?
20.
20
Yeah, we'll
million,
take
okay.
32.
I threw
Works
another
great.
10 in
I like
there.
that. I like how you think.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? There's some tax credits just for people listening if they want to help and then how far are you along in your fundraising, things like that? And
right. Good
what's the goal?
questions. Thanks. Our board of trustees agreed that it was time to renovate the Presidential Museum. It's been over 30 years, as we mentioned earlier. And so they went through a lengthy process to determine the fact that BRC Imagination Arts is going to create this concept design, which they have, and you've seen some of the images there. But it's a $20 million project to get this completed for the Presidential Museum. And we've today raised 12.9 million of that. We have received a wonderfully generous grant from the state of Iowa. Governor Reynolds awarded it last fall at our George W. Bush Celebration Banquet event, which I know you and Becky got to come to. That was a $5 million award from the state of Iowa that helps impact tourism and placemaking. Important for Iowans to have something for arts and culture. We impact that, as well as bringing folks in from out of town, out of state, to live here, to work here, to visit here. So we're excited to be a part of that with that $5 million award that's part of the 12.9 that we've raised so far. So our goal would really to be to raise the rest of the money, which is another 6-7 million, if you will, by roughly this time next year. Because what that means is we then can start the process of decommissioning what's currently in the exhibit space to make way for the new that will go on. And then that will close the library and museum for probably at least 12 months while the new pieces are installed and put all back together and everything finished from construction. So one of the things we're also talking about doing is taking the museum story on the road, especially around Iowa, perhaps even beyond, and have a mini exhibit, if you will, for various parts of the story around the state in different maybe libraries or other museums. Add on with that perhaps some programs about Hoover in those communities and those areas. So we want to make sure that Iowans know what's coming, but we also want to make sure they know that this is your story. This is Iowa's story, part of what the Hoover represents.
When did they build the library? When was it open?
Yeah, it just got dedicated in 62, 2 years. Hoover was 88 on his 88th birthday. Yeah, so it's been a while. They did a small renovation in the 70s, and then the most recent one was not since 1992.
Who funded it initially? The government?
Good question. So the way presidential libraries of this era, this type work, is that there's a private foundation like the Hoover Presidential Foundation. This is tasked with raising all of the money to build this. It is then turned over to the federal government, and the federal government runs the Presidential Museum. So they support, all of the maintenance to the building, all of the staff, the federal staff that work inside of it, and some of the programming. But what the foundation does is we continue to support programming and pieces that the federal government does not cover. Hoover's Hometown Days, we have speakers that come in, we have scholarship programs, and so many other aspects.
It's kind of neat.
Yeah,
So,
it's
because I
incredible.
noticed that there's federal, seems like a Smokey Bear hat, and they're patrolling it, so there must be federal
Right.
parks.
Right.
folks
So, and that's a unique piece about the Hoover grounds is it's 186 acres of a National Historic Site with a presidential library within it. So that's very unique. There are, I believe, only 2 or 3 other presidential libraries that also sit on a national park. So we have a doubly unique piece over here in West Branch.
And there's other houses. There's kind of like a wooden boardwalk in there. And there's who are the other homes? Or just in that period?
Yeah, so those homes are all homes from West Branch, original to town, that were moved in to kind of create a neighborhood experience like perhaps Hoover would have had in his upbringing. His home is on the original site, they believe, of where it was built. But those homes and the birthplace, the blacksmith shop his father would have worked in and the one-room school were all kind of situated to make a little bit of a historic village, if you will, feel. So when you're visiting, it seems like a neighborhood that Hoover would have lived in, which it would have. Some of those homes are actual historic homes of people who lived in the community, and they all are named and have little identification and information and background on them. So you can learn a little more about who the people were who lived in town nearby.
So you can contribute any amount, right?
You can't. Obviously, we've received $1 million gifts. We've received $10 gifts. And so they all make a difference for sure. And one of the neat things about contributing as an Iowan is that all gifts to this project from Iowa taxpayers, and they can be individuals, they can be financial institutions or companies, receive a 25% tax credit on their gift.
In the year you contribute.
In the year you contribute, or you can carry it forward for up to 5 years if you can't use it in the first year or 2. So it has a 5-year carry forward.
That should be
And
helpful.
that's a program that doesn't expire until the end of 2024. So the Iowa legislature approved that for us a couple years ago, and it's been amazing. We're really excited to have their support in that way.
And the foundation that you run also has, tell us about your scholarship program.
Yes, that's incredible because, again, it's based off of the Hoovers and their uncommon focus. So it's called the Uncommon Student Award Program, and high school juniors from around the state can apply. And we select, a committee selects 15 students to participate. Those students would create a project that they can carry out during the summer between their junior year and the fall of their senior year that is of service to others or emulates something that the Hoovers would have done, giving back to their community, creating an opportunity for others who might not have one. And those students come and learn about Herbert and Lou in the summer. And then in the fall, in October, we have our Helen and Stanley Howe. They're a family from Muscatine who have supported this program incredibly over the years. We have a presentation day that's named in their honor that all of these students come in. They present to a panel of judges and the public. It's an amazing thing to go watch, because if you want to be inspired by young people today and feel really good about our future, that is the place to be in October, and seeing these students share what they've done, even their failures are learning experiences, and teach them and share with the audience so much about what young people today are capable of. And it's fascinating. And so from that presentation day, there are selected 4 recipients of $10,000 awards each, but all of those participants, all 15, receive a $1,500 award. So it's pretty incredible. It's a wonderful scholarship program. There's even an opportunity for young people who go through that program, win one of those awards, and they might be going to the University of Iowa. There's another award there that those students can apply for on top of that, but they have to have come from the Hoover program, the Uncommon Student Award program. So,
what else would you like to share with us? We're going to wrap up here pretty quick about Hoover. Anything else that you can think of about the library or Hoover or Lou Ray's wife?
Yeah, Lou in herself could be a feature film. A phenomenal woman, twice president of the Girl Scouts of America, elected in that role or urged to participate in that role from Girl Scouts of America's founder, Juliette Lowe. Lou had a passion for young people. She had a passion for young women. And with the Girl Scouts, instead of just making cookies, let's get out and raise some funds and teach these girls how to sell the cookies, how to be in the outdoors, camping, hiking. Let's be active and participants in your own life and create for yourself. Lou was into fashion. Lou collected weapons from around the world, clothing from every culture. She spoke about 5 languages.
Didn't they speak to each other in Chinese? When it was private?
That.
I've heard when they wanted to just talk to each other in front of people, they'd speak Chinese.
I've heard that too. I don't know if that's myth or truth, but it could entirely be possible because of the time they spent in China and other places. But it's really an amazing place. And I'll tell you what, one really unique parting thing is today we have legacy family members who are both part of our board at the Hoover Presidential Foundation and beyond, who return every August, and sometimes more often than August, for Hoover's Hometown Days or other activities. And they care passionately about typically it's a great or great-great-grandfather now, his legacy, as well as their great-great-grandmother. And that is unusual, I believe, in a presidential museum's family legacy, but they really make a concerted effort and they very much care about what's happening.
Who spoke at the banquet last year in CR? It was his niece or
that was his great-granddaughter, Margaret Hoover. Okay. She did the interview with.
She was amazing. She interviewed George Bush.
Right. Great. She's terrific.
Well, we have a gym just down the interstate in West Branch. It's a Hoover Library, and if you haven't been there, I highly recommend you go and check it out. And also, we'd love it if you could contribute some money to the expansion of the library and all the neat things that are coming in exhibits. So anyway, Mundi, it's been fantastic. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for hosting me. Very much appreciate it.
Have a good one.
Thanks. You too.